There's a moment, right around the 47th minute, when your left knee stops being a knee. It becomes a conversation you're having with yourself, a negotiation, a hostage situation where the hostage is your dignity and the kidnapper is a joint that has been locked in the same angle since 6:42 in the morning. You don't bend it. You don't shift weight to the other leg. You breathe through your nose, which has been running since the rain started, and you stare at a fixed point somewhere above the head of a man in a yellow cagoule who is currently trying to get his toddler to stop licking the iron fence. She is not succeeding. The toddler doesn't care. The toddler has opinions about the fence. My name is Daniel Marsh, and the year I turned 23, I stood in front of Buckingham Palace for 8 consecutive hours and learned something that nobody in the recruitment pamphlet thought to mention. Stillness is not rest. Stillness is violence done quietly to yourself from the inside out, and you have to learn to love it or it will break you in ways that don't show up on any scan. It was October when they assigned me to the front post. Not the glamorous October of films and foliage, the London kind, which is gray and damp and smells faintly of pigeons making questionable life choices. The sky that morning had the look of something that had given up trying to be sky and was just sort of existing overhead as an act of minimum effort. 6:45, I was in position. My bearskin was already collecting drizzle. My boots, polished the previous evening to a standard that would have made my grandfather weep, were about to be tested by puddles the color of old pewter. The crowd was already there. They're always already there, and I still don't know when they arrive or whether they sleep nearby or whether they simply spring fully formed from the pavement like particularly cold mushrooms. Tourists, dozens of them, phones out, arms extended, the universal posture of humans who are somewhere significant and need to prove it. A woman in a magenta puffer jacket was holding her phone sideways with the concentration of someone defusing a device. 2 teenage boys, German, I guess from the snatches of conversation, were doing that thing where they stand next to the guardsman position and do a mock march, goose-stepping while their father films it and pretends he isn't also charmed. I had seen this routine approximately 400 times. I kept my eyes on the middle distance. That's the trick they teach you, and the trick doesn't feel like a trick until you understand what you're actually doing, which is choosing not to see what you can see. It is a discipline of willful peripheral blur. You take everything that is happening, the magenta jacket, the licking child, the father and his teenage sons, the old couple who set up a folding stool directly in your sight line as though they're watching cricket, and you allow it all to become texture. Noise without information. Movement without meaning. The first hour is almost manageable. Your muscles are still warm from a march down. Your body hasn't fully processed the situation yet. There's still something that functions like alertness humming around in your chest. You are a soldier of the crown, in position at the gates of the palace, fulfilling a tradition that is older than most countries currently operating. There is, if you let yourself feel it for exactly 1 second, something immense about that. 1 second, then your right shoulder starts. The shoulder thing is not pain exactly. Pain has edges. Pain has an address. What the shoulder does is more like a question that won't stop being asked. A low, insistent inquiry somewhere between the blade and the socket repeating. Are you sure about this? Are you absolutely certain you want to remain in this particular position? Because I have some thoughts. I was 23. I had trained for this. I had done the drills, the marches, the ceremonial rehearsals in conditions that were specifically designed to be miserable, because miserable is the examination and passing it is the credential. I knew the shoulder would do its thing. I had been told. Knowing and experiencing are, I will confirm for you now, completely different categories of information. The tourists cycled through in waves. That's the thing about this post. Nobody stays long. They come, they take the photo, they leave. Their suffering is approximately 45 seconds. They get the image of the motionless soldier, and then they go and have a coffee and show each other the image, and the soldier stays there, having experienced their 45-second from completely different direction. Around the 50-minute mark, something shifted in the crowd. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happens in the first hour. If anything dramatic happens in the first hour, you're either very lucky or something has gone genuinely wrong. This was subtler, a kind of gathering. The tourists who had been cycling through started to start to stay. Phones that had been put away came back out. The two German teenagers abandoned their mock march and stood very still, which is the thing humans do when they sense that something is about to be worth watching. I didn't move my eyes to find the source. My eyes were on the fixed point, Mine, the one I had chosen that morning and claimed and intended to keep for the duration of the watch. A small architectural detail on the gatehouse. Consistent, reliable, not going anywhere. The murmuring intensified. A child, not the fence-licking one, a different child, maybe 8 years old, with the solemn face of someone who takes field trips seriously, had gotten separated from her group. Not lost. The kind of separated that happens in crowds when you stop to look at something and the group keeps moving and then you look up and the math has changed. She was standing about 4 feet to my left, holding a laminated museum leaflet like a boarding pass, scanning the crowd with an expression that was trying very hard not to be frightened and mostly failing. The crowd noticed her. The crowd did that thing crowds do, which is notice and observe and murmur and wait for someone else to act, because there's always a social contract in crowds that assigns responsibility to anyone but the people currently present. Phones came up, not to help, to document. The German father lowered his camera slightly, then raised it again. The woman in the magenta jacket glanced toward the child and then toward the gate, assessing, calculating. The child stood there with her laminated leaflet. I was watching all of this in my peripheral vision, which by this point in a watch has been sharpened to something approaching a second sense. You don't look. You know. The fixed point held. The shoulder asked its question. The knee began its shift from joint to concept. And then the child looked at me. Not at the spectacle of me. Not with the tourist look that says here is a curiosity in a hat. She looked at me the way people look at things they hope might help. Direct. Unguarded. The look of someone who has run their options and arrived, somewhat reluctantly, at an unusual door. I want to be clear about something. The regulations are explicit. They are not suggestions. They are the architecture of the post. You do not speak. You do not gesture. You do not break position for anything below a specific threshold of emergency. And that threshold is defined in language that is precise and unambiguous. The tradition exists not as cruelty, but as contract. The stillness is what makes the ceremony work, and the ceremony is what makes the history visible, and the history is the whole point. Break one brick, you weaken the wall. I knew all of this. My fixed point held. The child's laminated leaflet trembled slightly in a gust off the mall. Around me, the crowd had grown. 30 people, maybe 40, all of them watching the same tableau. Motionless soldier, lost child, the gap between them that was exactly the width of protocol. A man in a green jacket near the railing was whispering something to his wife. The wife shook her head. The two German teenagers had stopped completely. The fence-licking toddler, freed from her previous obsession, was now watching the child with the frank curiosity of someone to whom social complexity has not yet been explained. The child didn't look away from me. I don't know what she was reading in my face. Probably nothing. The face is trained too, neutral to the point of sculpture. But she kept looking the way you keep knocking on a door you're not sure has anyone behind it, because the alternative to knocking is walking away, and walking away means admitting that you're alone. She was not yet crying. She was doing the thing that comes before crying, which is its own particular kind of awful. The crowd watched. I breathed through my nose, which was still running. The shoulder asked its question. The knee filed an official complaint with the relevant department. And somewhere in my chest, below the discipline, below the training, below the 800 years of tradition that I was currently embodying in a damp bearskin on a Tuesday morning in October, something that was entirely mine and entirely not the soldier's shifted on its axis like a compass finding north. The fixed point held. I want you to understand that. The fixed point held. But my eyes moved to her. 2 degrees, maybe 3, not a turn of the head, not a gesture, the tiniest perceptible shift of human gaze, which from 3 feet away is invisible to a camera, but is completely legible to a lost 8-year-old who is looking for evidence that she has been seen. She had been seen. I watched her register it. The small exhale, the shoulders coming down half an inch, the laminated leaflet stopping its trembling because the hand holding it had steadied. She didn't move toward me. She didn't speak. She looked back into the crowd with something restored in her face. Not certainty, not safety, but the first cousin of both, which is, I am not invisible here. And then, because the world is not interested in clean dramatic arcs, a woman in a school group lanyard came barreling out of the crowd with the energy of someone who's been doing head counts and arriving at the wrong number for the last 4 minutes. And she grabbed the child's hand and said something in rapid, relieved French, and the child said something back, and the laminated leaflet got tucked under an arm, and they were gone into the crowd in the way that crises resolve when you're standing still, not with fanfare, not with resolution, just present, 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 then gone. The crowd dispersed. The German teenagers resumed their mock march. The father resumed his filming, laughing now. The woman in the magenta jacket found a better angle and took the photo she'd come for. I returned my eyes to the fixed point. The shoulder asked its question. The knee filed its complaint. The drizzle continued its investigation of my collar. 43 minutes left in the watch, and the only evidence that anything had happened was a small, warm thing sitting in my chest that had no name in the training manual and didn't need one. Standing still is not the absence of effort. It is effort wearing a different coat. It is the decision, made once and then made again every 7 seconds for 8 hours, to hold the line while everything, your body, the weather, the crowd, the 8-year-old with a laminated leaflet, pulls at you from every available direction. I learned this on a Tuesday in October. I'm still learning it. Everyone talks about the stillness as a visual thing. The soldier at the gate, the bearskin, the red tunic, the rigid arms. They describe it because they can photograph it. What they cannot photograph is the acoustic landscape of 8 hours at the post, which is its own kind of relentless. Pigeons. The specific, committed cooing of London pigeons who have decided that the stone ledge 6 inches from your left shoulder is prime real estate and intend to defend this position through sheer persistence. The hydraulic wheeze of tourist coaches on the mall. Fragments of a dozen languages arriving and departing like radio signals. A joke in Spanish, a child's complaint in Japanese, the universal grammar of someone narrating what they're filming in a voice that's performing for the camera rather than actually speaking to anyone. The distant music from a busker near Victoria who is playing a guitar version of something that might be a Beatles song and might be something else entirely, and the ambiguity of it is somehow worse than either answer would be. And beneath all of that, quieter and more insistent than any of it, your own blood. The specific, metronomic thud of your own heart, which you become aware of somewhere around the second hour when everything external has been processed into white noise, and what remains is the machinery of you, running, unasked, faithful. I was 23. I thought I knew my body. I did not know my body. I knew what my body could do when I told it to move. I had no data on what my body would do when I told it to stay. The second watch day was a Thursday in November, and it was the one where I learned about the man with the notebook. He arrived at 9:17, which I know because I had developed by that point the ability to read the clock on the building opposite without appearing to look at anything other than my fixed point, a skill that sounds small and is not small, that took 2 weeks to develop, and represented a genuine psychological adaptation to a situation the human nervous system was not designed for. He was maybe 65, gray overcoat, sensible shoes, the kind of face that has been lived in comfortably for a long time. He carried a small leather notebook, already open, and a pen that he held the way people hold things they use daily, without thinking, without ceremony. He found a position at the far edge of the railing and stood there and began to write. Not photograph, right? This was unusual enough that it registered in my peripheral awareness as a category distinct from the general tourist texture. Everyone photographs. The odd one sketches. You get the art students occasionally, which is its own experience because art students have a particular quality of sustained attention that tourists don't, a willingness to look at the same thing for 45 minutes that most people reserve for screens. But a man with a notebook writing at the Royal Guard post at 9:17 on a Thursday in November, that was a specific kind of intention I couldn't immediately categorize. I filed it in the peripheral and continued watching my fixed point. He was still there at 9:45. He had not moved from his position. He wrote, paused, looked up, wrote again. Occasionally, he tilted his head the way people do when they're searching for a word. He was maybe 20 feet away, and the crowd between us was thin enough that I could, if I'd been willing to be obvious about it, watched him directly. I was not willing to be obvious about it. I was the Royal Guard. I had a fixed point and a tradition and a bearskin collecting November moisture. At 10:03, he looked up from the notebook and looked directly at me. Not the tourist look, not the performance documenting look. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of music you're trying to understand, with attention that has given up trying to consume the thing and is just trying to be near it properly. He nodded. I did not nod back. The protocol, the wall, the 800 years. He didn't seem offended. He went back to writing. At 10:22, he left. He walked in the direction of St. James's Park, notebook under his arm, overcoat buttoned against the wind, at the steady pace of someone who is in no particular hurry and knows exactly where they're going. He didn't look back. I did not watch him go. My fixed point held. But the question he'd raised with his hour of quiet watching stayed in me for the rest of the shift, sitting somewhere between my shoulder blades where I couldn't reach it. What was he writing? I'm going to tell you something about the body under sustained stillness that nobody who hasn't experienced it will entirely believe. It starts speaking, not metaphorically, physically. The body, deprived of its usual repertoire of micro-movements, the small adjustments, the weight shifts, the scratches and stretches and fidgets that you never notice because you do them constantly, develops a vocabulary of sensation that it uses to conduct what I can only describe as a one-sided conversation. Your right ear itches with the specificity of a declaration. Your lower back assembles a grievance that has structure and grammar. The ball of your left foot, somewhere around hour 4, produces a sensation that has no clinical name but which I would describe as a small bright burning that is not quite pain and refuses to be anything else. You cannot respond to any of this. You stand there and you listen to your own body making its case against you, and you breathe through your nose, and you hold the fixed point, and you learned slowly over weeks of watches that the body is not your enemy in this situation. It is just used to being overruled. It is accustomed to being the loudest voice in the room, and here you are telling it politely, but completely that it is not, in fact, the loudest voice in the room. The tradition is, the position is, the 800 years of soldiers who stood here before you and held the line are. The body eventually accepts this. It doesn't stop speaking. It never stops speaking, but it learns to speak at a volume that you can acknowledge without obeying. This is the thing nobody puts in a pamphlet. The discipline is not about suppressing yourself. It's about learning which self to listen to. The man with the notebook came back on a Tuesday, 3 weeks later. I recognized him immediately. The gray overcoat, the sensible shoes, the leather notebook already open. He took the same position at the far railing, and he wrote, and he paused, and looked up, and he wrote again. He was there for an hour and 6 minutes this time. I know because by then I had become, despite myself, aware of his arrival and departure in a way you become aware of weather patterns, not looking for them exactly, but recognizing them when they come. When he left, he did something he hadn't done before. He stopped at the edge of the railing, closed the notebook, and stood there for a moment looking at me with an expression that was, and I've thought about this a great deal since, not pity, not fascination, not the tourist's proprietary delight at the curiosity. It was something closer to recognition. The look of someone who sees in an external thing a version of something they carry internally. Then he walked towards St. James's Park and was gone. I stood in the November cold with my fixed point and my shoulder and my left foot's ongoing small bright burning, and I thought, this man is writing about something that has nothing to do with me and everything to do with what I represent, and I will never know what it is, and that is exactly as it should be. The day of the incident, because there was an incident, there is always an incident, the question is only what kind, was a Wednesday in the same November, 10 days before they were rotating me to a different post. The crowd was heavier than usual. A school trip, the larger kind, the kind where the organizational structure has already started to break down, and the teachers have the haunted look of people who agreed to this months ago and are now reckoning with the consequences. Maybe 60 children, ages ranging from what looked like 7 to what looked like 15, spread across the railing area with the organic chaos of mercury spilled on glass. The younger ones wanted to touch everything. The older ones wanted to perform indifference with enough conviction to impress each other. The teachers moved between both groups with the efficiency of people who have been doing this long enough to have developed a system, but even systems have gaps. The gap, on this particular Wednesday, took the shape of a boy, 12, maybe 13. The age where the body has started making architectural decisions the occupant hasn't signed off on yet. All awkward elevation, sudden lengths of limb, a face that hadn't decided what it was becoming. He was at the outer edge of the group, which is where the ones with something to prove tend to locate themselves, and he was being watched by two other boys his age with the specific attention that means, "We are waiting to see what you'll do." What he did was climb the fence. Not all the way, not the full height. The boy was 12, not deranged. He got one foot on the lower railing and grabbed the upper rail and swung himself up and out about 18 inches beyond the perimeter, putting himself in territory that was no longer tourist lawful, grinning at his audience with the grin of someone who's made a decision and is now fully committed to the consequences. The crowd noticed. The crowd always notices when the rules are being tested. There was a ripple, the intake of breath, the subtle reorientation of bodies, the phones rising. I had seen fence incidents before. The protocol is clear and it is physical, and I won't detail it here because it's not mine to detail, but what I will tell you is that the fence incident doesn't reach the stage where protocol becomes action until a specific threshold is crossed, and the threshold is sustained, deliberate, intended breach. A child showing off is not the same as a threat. A child showing off is a child showing off, and the response to a child showing off is proportional and considered, not theatrical. So I stood there. I held the fixed point. The boy held the fence. His two friends were laughing. The crowd was watching. One of the teachers had spotted him and was moving through the group toward him, calling his name. I couldn't hear the name in the crowd noise, but I could see the shape of the shout, the trajectory of her movement, the controlled urgency of someone who's trying not to make the situation bigger by visibly panicking about it. The boy, aware of the teacher's approach, did what boys that age do when they have committed to a performance and the audience is watching and the authority figure is 40 feet away and closing. He went further. Not down, not back. He reached one hand up to a higher rail, got his foot to a higher bar, and pulled himself up another 8 inches. The crowd made a sound. The teacher said the name again, louder now. The boy looked at me, same as the child with the laminated leaflet, except entirely different. The lost child had looked at me hoping to be seen. This boy looked at me calculating, measuring, running the math on what I would do, what I could do, whether the soldier was a variable in his equation or scenery. I held the fixed point. The boy held the fence. The teacher was 20 feet away, and then the boy's foot slipped. Not a fall, not a crisis. The kind of slip that happens when you've climbed further than your confidence actually extends, and your body knows it before your ego does. A single second of scrambling, of arms grabbing at the rail too hard, of a sharp inhale from a 12-year-old who has just discovered that showing off has load-bearing limits. He caught himself, both hands on the upper rail, feet back on the lower, safe, embarrassed. The crowd exhaled. His two friends had stopped laughing. The teacher reached him and said something in a low, fierce voice that carried even through the crowd noise by virtue of its quality alone. And the boy climbed down, and the teacher gripped his shoulder, and the group began to reform and move on with the herding efficiency of a school trip that is now slightly behind schedule. The boy looked back at me once as he was being moved away, not calculating this time. The math had already been run. The answer had been, further is not always better. The wall does not move. The wall was always going to be there. I don't know if that's what he was thinking. I don't know what 12-year-old boys think. What I know is the look and The look was the specific one that means something has been understood that wasn't understood before. The fixed point held. The crowd moved on. The shoulder asked its question. Somewhere in the direction of St. James's Park, maybe, though I had no way of knowing, a man in a gray overcoat was writing in a leather notebook about stillness and what it costs and what it means and getting some of it right and some of it wrong, the way everyone who tries to write about living things gets some of it right and some of it wrong. The drizzle had stopped. For approximately 4 minutes, the sun appeared over the palace, pale, November thin, lasting no longer than a rumor. And the puddles on the forecourt lit up like briefly minted coins, and the tourists turned their faces up, and the guard at the adjacent post shifted his bearskin almost imperceptibly, the way even disciplined things acknowledge moments that deserve acknowledgement. I held a fixed point. The sun went back behind the cloud. 2 hours and 7 minutes remained in the watch. The body continued its conversation. I continued, politely but completely, to overrule it. The last watch I did at that post was a Friday in December, and I'm going to tell you about it the way it actually happened, which means I'm going to tell you about the 15 minutes before, because the 15 minutes before are the part everyone skips and the part that contains everything. You march to the post. You don't arrive at the post. You march there, and the march is part of the ceremony, and the ceremony starts then, not when you arrive. Your boots on the stone, the rhythm. Left, right, the specific weight of full ceremonial dress, which is heavier than it looks, and looks like it weighs approximately what a small car weighs, so. The palace behind you as you come through the gate. December sky, the color of filing cabinet, low and committed. And in those 15 minutes of marching, there's a window, a small one, closing as you walk, where you are still entirely yourself. Not the guard, not the tradition, not the living embodiment of 800 years of institutional memory. Just Daniel Marsh, 23 from Northampton, who grew up in a terraced house next to a chip shop and supported the wrong football club and had a shelf of science fiction novels he never admitted to anyone in the regiment. The window closes when you arrive at the post. You choose to close it. Every time. It is an act of will, and it happens so quickly over so many watches that it starts to feel automatic, but is never actually automatic. It is always chosen. And what you don't know at 23 is that this is the real training. Not the drills. Not the discipline. The choosing. Every 7 seconds, for 8 hours, a choice. The man in the gray overcoat was there when I arrived. He had not been there at the beginning of any previous watch. He always came later, after 9, when a morning crowd had thinned and the day had settled into its rhythm. But today he was there at 6:50, standing at the far railing with his notebook closed for once, just looking at the palace. He looked at me when I marched into position. I settled. Fixed point. The shoulder took note of my return. The architecture of the post reassembled itself around me. The man opened his notebook. I don't know why I'm telling you this in such detail. I've been asked since to describe the watches by family, by friends who think the ceremonial guard is interesting in the vague way that anything you haven't done yourself seems interesting by the one journalist who did a piece on a regiment and needed color quotes. I always describe it in terms of the physical challenge, the discipline, the tradition. These things are all true. What I don't usually describe, what I'm describing now for the first time, to no one in particular, and therefore perhaps to everyone, is the accumulated weight of all those small moments that the cameras never caught. The lost child with the laminated leaflet. The 12-year-old calculating how far the fence went. The November sun that lasted 4 minutes over the forecourt. The specific quality of being watched by someone who is writing rather than someone who is photographing. These things don't appear in the record. They happened in the periphery, in the space between the fixed point and everything it filtered out, and they happened to the part of me that wasn't the guard, to Daniel from Northampton, standing inside the ceremony, being changed by it in ways that the ceremony itself would never officially acknowledge. The December crowd was thin. Cold does that, keeps the casual tourists back, leaves the committed ones, the ones who've traveled far enough that the weather is not a deterrent, who came for this specifically, who are not going to let a filing cabinet sky between them and what they came to see. An older couple arrived at about 7:20 and stood at the railing without taking their phones out. This is rarer than you'd think. Much rarer. In 2 months at this post, I had seen it perhaps 4 times. People who simply stood and watched without the mediation of a screen, without the need to prove the experience to some future audience. They were, at a guess, in their mid-70s. He had a flat cap and a cane he was not leaning on yet, just carrying as a kind of available option. She had the kind of coat that is warm in a serious way, not in a fashionable way. They stood together with the particular closeness of people who have been near each other for so long that proximity has become structural. They watched the post. They watched me, not with the tourist gaze, not with the notebook man's quiet analytical attention. They watched with the relaxed steadiness of people who were somewhere they've been before and are in no hurry to have finished being here. After about 10 minutes, the woman said something to the man. I couldn't hear it. He nodded. She reached in her coat pocket and produced what appeared to be a wrapped toffee, which she offered to him, and he declined with a small gesture, and she unwrapped it herself and stood there eating it, watching me, and the absolute normality of it, the toffee, the flat cap, the borrowed cane, standing at the gate of Buckingham Palace at 7:30 in December, eating a toffee like it was a Tuesday afternoon in their own living room, did something to me that I was not prepared for, and cannot now entirely describe. It landed. That's all I can tell you. Whatever they were, whatever they carried, whatever they'd lived, whoever they'd lost or loved or argued with or buried or held, it landed in me the way certain things land when you've been standing still long enough that your filters are thin and the world comes through with less obstruction than usual. I held the fixed point. The toffee wrapper went into her pocket. They stayed until nearly 9, and when they left, they walked the kind of slow walk that is not slow because of difficulty, but because they have decided at this point that rushing is for people who haven't figured out what's worth their time yet. The man with the notebook was still there. He'd been writing consistently, pausing, writing again. His hand moved in the unhurried way of someone who is not on a deadline. At some point around 8:30, he looked up from the notebook and sat for a long time doing nothing, just holding the open notebook in one hand, pen in the other, face tipped slightly upward, as though he was listening for something. Then he wrote for a long time. 3, for minutes of sustained writing. The most I'd seen him write in any of the sessions. When he stopped, he looked at what he'd written, read it once, and made a small nod to himself that was the most private gesture I had ever witnessed in a public space. He closed the notebook. He looked at me. I was 6 weeks into my rotation at this post. I had stood here in this position on 16 separate occasions. I had been rained on, drizzled on, breathed on, photographed approximately 12,000 times. This is not hyperbole. The palace estimates that the guard is the most photographed public figure in London on any given day, which is a fact that sits in a very specific way. I had held the fixed point through cold and wind and the shoulders questions and the knees complaints and the left foot's small bright burning and the body's entire sustained monologue about the situation. I had watched a lost child find herself seen. I had watched a 12-year-old discover the limits of showing off. I had watched an old couple eat a toffee at the gate of a palace, as though the world owed them exactly this, and they were collecting. I had been watched for weeks by a man writing something in a leather notebook that I would never read. The man looked at me now with the expression of someone who has been trying to put words around something for a long time, and has gotten as close as language will take him, and is making peace with the remainder. He stood up from the railing. He put the notebook in his coat pocket. He walked directly toward the gate, toward me, which tourists do not do. They stay at the railing. The gate area is for the guard, and the guard alone. But he walked toward me, and he stopped at the boundary that everyone who comes here understands without being told about. And he stood there for a moment looking at me from a distance of maybe 6 feet. He said nothing. I said nothing. The protocol is the protocol. The wall is the wall. But I want to tell you, and this is the thing I have never told anyone, not the regiment, not my family, not the journalist. I want to tell you that in that 6 feet of December morning, something passed between us that did not require language and would have been diminished by it. A recognition, not of each other, of the same thing in each other. The thing that costs. The thing that doesn't show. The thing that standing still teaches you, slowly, at the level below the body and below the training, in the part of yourself that is no ceremony and all-person. He nodded once. He turned and walked towards St. James's Park, and the gray December light accepted him, and he was gone. The watch ended at 2:45. The relief came. The formal exchange. The march back. That window opened again. 15 minutes of marching. Daniel from Northampton. The filing cabinet sky. The chip shop terraced house. The science fiction novels. The closing watch of a posting that had taken something from me, in the way that all worthwhile things take something from you, and given me something larger back. I want to tell you what it gave me, and I'm going to try, but I'll tell you up front that language does this particular thing poorly, so you're going to have to meet me halfway. The watches gave me a relationship with time that I didn't have before. Not an understanding of it. I don't claim that. It's too large a claim. But a relationship, an intimacy, when you stand still for 8 hours, when you cannot move, when you cannot speak, when you cannot respond to the river of the world flowing past you except with absolute stillness. Time becomes texturized. It isn't flat. It has surfaces. The 47th minute is different in quality from the 32nd, different from the third hour, different from the moment right before the watch ends when your body knows, somehow, impossibly knows, that it's nearly over and floods with something that is relief and something that is underneath the relief very quietly loss. Because the stillness is hard and it is exhausting and your shoulder asks its question and your knee files its complaints and the body monologues without cease, and you would give almost anything in the early weeks to be done with it. And then somewhere around the 6th watch, you stop wanting to be done with it. Not because it gets easier. It does not get easier. It gets more familiar, which is completely different. It gets to be the thing you know rather than the thing that's being done to you. And in that shift from victim of the stillness to inhabiter of it, something settles in you that is heavier and steadier than anything moving has ever given you. I met the man with the notebook once more. 6 months later, off duty, St. James's Park. I was in civilian clothes, nobody's guard, just a person on a bench eating a sandwich. He walked past on the path with his overcoat and his notebook, and he would not have recognized me. You really don't, out of uniform, out of the bearskin, out of position. The ceremony is a container, and the person inside, it is mostly invisible to the people outside. But I recognized him immediately. He sat on a bench 3 benches down and opened his notebook and wrote for 20 minutes. Then he closed it and sat for a while watching the ducks on the lake, which had opinions about who owned which stretch of water, and were not keeping those opinions to themselves. I thought about walking over. I thought about saying, I was the one at the post. You came with your notebook 16 times. I watched you when you weren't watching me. I didn't do it. Not because it would have been wrong exactly, but because the thing that passed between us at 6 feet on a December morning already existed as a complete thing, and adding language to it would have been like, I don't know. Like writing a caption under a painting that already tells you everything. He stood up eventually and walked deeper into the park, notebook under his arm, at the unhurried pace of someone who knows what's worth their time. I finished my sandwich. There's a thing you learn in the regiment that they tell you plainly and early, and it sounds like practical information and is actually philosophy. Stillness is not the absence of effort. It is effort's highest form. You nod when they tell you this. You file it. You probably think you understand it. You don't understand it. You can't understand it at the stage of being told. You understand on the 47th minute of the 3rd watch, when your left knee has stopped being a knee, and your shoulder is conducting its inquiry, and the rain is making its investigation of your collar, and a man in a yellow cagoule is failing to stop his toddler from licking the fence, and you have 4 hours and 13 minutes left, and you hold the fixed point, and you choose again for the 400 and something time today to stay. And then you understand it. And then it costs you something every time you practice it. And the cost is the point, and you pay it, and you pay it, and you pay it, and slowly, 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 the pain becomes a form of wealth. They rotated me to a different post in January. I left something at the gate of the palace when I went. I don't know what to call it. Some version of the person who arrived in October, not knowing what stillness cost. He stayed. He became part of the stone, part of the tradition, part of the accumulated invisible weight of all the soldiers who held the line before and after and were changed by it in ways that the photographs don't show. What I took with me was simpler. The knowledge that movement is not the same as progress. That stillness is not the same as surrender. That the hardest thing the body can be asked to do is to remain precisely and deliberately in one place. And that the person who can do this, who can hold the line in the face of everything that pulls and itches and asks and complains and calculates and performs and weeps and licks the fence and looks at you hoping to be seen, that person is not standing still. That person is working harder than anyone around them can see, which is, in the end, the only kind of work that changes anything permanently. The man in the gray overcoat wrote something in his notebook and nodded at it like it was right. I think about that nod sometimes. I think, whatever he found, I was standing in it. I think, whatever he was looking for, he came back 16 times. I think, that's what it looks like from the outside when someone is learning something that won't show up on any scan. You keep coming back. You stand at the railing. You watch.